Hike along any stream in the Adirondack wilderness, and you'll see old dead trees that have fallen into the water and are decomposing. Those logs are actually playing a role in keeping climate change from getting worse. They capture and store carbon. Researchers are learning new things about these quietly forgotten fixtures of our wilderness. That's today's story of the day.
Support for Story of the Day comes from Morja Wealth Management, serving the North Country for 3 generations. MorjaWM.com. Securities offered through Hightower Securities, LLC, member FINRA, SIPC. Hightower is an SEC-registered investment advisor. And Kinney Drugs, now offering specialized home medical equipment and supplies. Learn more at kinneyhomecare.com.
Hey, I'm David Sommerstein. It's Tuesday, May 13th. First up, the state legislature will hold a special hearing on New York's prison system tomorrow. Lawmakers and criminal justice advocates are using the hearing to shed light on increased violence in correctional facilities. Jung-Yoon Han from the New York Public News Network reports.
The legislative hearing will focus on the violent deaths of inmates Robert Brooks and Messiah Nantwi in 2 separate facilities in recent months. About 20 prison guards have been charged in connection to the deaths. Lawmakers will also question watchdogs and corrections officials on a 3-week-long prison strike from earlier this year. It led the state to fire about 2,000 corrections officers. Melanie Bishop is a member of Community Care Alternatives. She says prisons have become increasingly unsafe for both incarcerated people and guards, and it's the right time for lawmakers to implement reforms.
I hope they focus on the fact that there needs to be transparency in those facilities.
Progressive leaders in the legislature are using the hearing as a chance to also push measures that didn't make it into this year's state budget, including the Earned Time Act. It would expand ways for individuals to accumulate good behavior credits to go towards early release. In Albany, I'm Jung-Yoon Han for the New York Public News Network.
Researchers from the University of Vermont are studying how dead trees in streams store carbon. They're specifically focused on the Adirondacks and New Hampshire. Emily Russell spoke with forestry professor William Keaton and PhD candidate Stephen Peters-Kollar about how those downed trees become natural climate solutions. Peters-Kollar says they aim to fill a gap in the scientific understanding of carbon storage.
The specific interest in the carbon storage of wood in streams came about in part because in the eastern U.S., there's really limited, if any, information on the amount of carbon stored in dead wood in streams. We have great data on the amount of carbon stored in dead wood on the forest floor, but really no one had looked at that in the streams and the East Coast. And so we wanted to get the first understanding of how much carbon was stored here, as well as how that changes as forests are aging. And so that's part of the reason we use these 2 sites, the Hubbard Brook Experimental Forest, which are those middle-aged forests in New Hampshire, and then these much older forests in the Adirondacks. So we could look at how age and characteristics of the forest impacted the amount of carbon stored in dead wood in these streams.
Is there a simple way to explain how you determine carbon storage and measure that out in those 2 places?
Probably the simplest way is that we had great field crews from the University of Vermont. And so we spent several summers out walking up and down these streams, basically measuring all of the wood in the streams. And so we'd be climbing over these big log jams and ducking underneath to measure length and diameter and all these sorts of things. And then we bring that back into the lab, and there are some well-researched calculations on how you convert these measurements we took into carbon numbers.
Why was it important to compare the carbon storage in wood in old growth forests compared to mature growth forests in New Hampshire? And what did you find in terms of the difference between carbon storage in those 2 different places?
Bill, you can jump in.
There's huge interest these days in the role that forests can play as a natural climate solution, helping us fight climate change by sequestering carbon and then storing it in biomass. But a missing piece of our understanding of how that works is the carbon storage value that streams might provide and that wood in streams might provide. Now, we know that wood levels reach their highest in these old growth streams in places like the Adirondacks. But the question is, how much wood do these younger forests have, and are they on their way towards redeveloping similar levels of wood and carbon storage as we might see in an old growth forest? And so, as we've said, the majority of our forests in the Northeast are young or middle-aged, and really only about halfway along this pathway of recovery. So it stands to reason that as they continue to age and as large woody debris accumulates in the stream, that carbon sink or that bank of stored carbon will continue to accumulate. And I think Stephen's work, our work, estimates that those old forests store something like 4 to 5 times as much or more than mature forests, which suggests that there's a lot more sink capacity for carbon storage in our streams.
How can what you guys found be used, outside the scientific community? Like, why does this research matter?
Stephen, why don't you take a crack at this?
Yeah, I think there's a few ways that this has importance to non-scientific folks. I think for people actively working on land management, there are many folks, either landowners or land managers, who are interested in using their land as a natural climate solution to help take carbon out of the atmosphere and store it on the landscape. And previously, when people are thinking about this, they haven't really considered streams or really freshwater systems in general. And so I think this starts, hopefully, a conversation where landowners and land managers can start to incorporate these values, the amount of carbon stored in wood in streams, and potentially later on, maybe other freshwater systems in their use as a natural climate solution. And I think there's maybe some value as well in thinking about what are called strategic wood additions. So there's a lot of work across the Northeast that looks to actively add wood to streams because, as we discussed, the streams have much less wood in them than they used to when we had older forests. And I think this shows another benefit to that type of land management work, these strategic wood additions that already are being used for fish habitat and flood control and a variety of other aspects.
I wonder, after doing this research, spending so much time out there in the Adirondacks and in the White Mountains, did it make you see the world differently, or just kind of like think differently about, as Stephen, you say, natural climate solutions?
Well, I can jump in first, since Dr. Keaton's been working on this for 2 decades, so it might have had more change in my perspective. I think one of the things that it really highlights for me is the interconnectedness of nature. Often people tend to think about forests or streams or lakes rather than thinking about how these systems impact each other. And, in our work, we saw that the land clearing of forests has really had a profound impact on streams. And so trying to understand how everything works together. And also, I think there's some value to appreciating the messiness of these systems and knowing that a stream that has a lot of wood in it and wood that's crisscrossed and forming these log jams is actually really healthy and really good for a system, rather than just viewing it as a mess in an otherwise neat landscape.
Those are great answers. I'll just add that I've always been a big tree lover. I love big trees. And I think this study brought to light yet another value that large trees provide.
That was William Keaton, a forestry professor at the University of Vermont, and PhD candidate Stephen Peters-Kollar, speaking with Emily Russell. Our Climate Change series is made possible through the generous support of Margot and John Ernst. You can find all the stories in our series at ncpr.org/climate. More news all the time on our website, ncpr.org. Music today by Caitlin Scholl of Lake Placid and Ben Sharon of Watertown. I'm David Summerstein, North Country Public Radio.